Hey everyone, welcome to today's webinar entitled Harnessing AI Productivity for Your Fleet. We're just going to give it a couple of seconds for the room to fill up. Thanks for joining us. All right, well, listen, I see the room filling up. Let's get going on this webinar here today. I'm Chris Brown. I'm Associate Publisher for Automotive Fleet. I'll be your moderator for today's event. Before I introduce our panelists, you know why we're here. We're going to talk AI, right? AI has been a part of our lives for just over 2 years now. And, you know, we're in this world now where generative AI has become one of the most important productivity tools on the planet. People are calling it like the new electricity, and they're saying it's bigger than the internet. But think about it. It's had very little incubation. When ChatGPT was launched, it was immediately harnessed. I don't know any other technological revolution in history that really experienced this trajectory. So, you know, with something this powerful, it's kind of, dare I say, warping our space-time continuum. It's causing a little bit of apprehension as with all the promise, right? Well, we're here to help you get a handle on all that, how you can use AI, how you can jump in right now. Listen, before I introduce our panelists, you know the drill. You have an opportunity to ask questions in the chat. If we don't get to those questions, we'll be sure to email you after the fact. But we do expect a really robust conversation, and we'd love to have your input here. So first, I would like to introduce Susanna Hicks. She's AI strategist for Merchants Fleet. Susanna.
Hey, thanks. Thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. As you mentioned, I am the AI strategist for Merchants Fleet, and I'm really looking forward to talking about the possibilities of AI in fleet management.
Great. And we also have Mike Branch, Vice President of Data and Analytics for Geotab. Hey, Mike.
Hey, Chris. Happy to be here today. Really excited about this. I've, you know, AI has been a long part of our trajectory for the last few years, and I know you mentioned, you know, only 2 years ago it really hit the mainstream, but it's been around for, you know, since the 1950s. Really, it's had a huge acceleration curve over the last couple of years, thanks to generative AI and ChatGPT. But yeah, so my background, I manage a team of data scientists, data engineers, AI engineers here at Geotab. So really excited about this conversation that we're going to have together today.
Great. Well, I'm going to turn it over to Susanna and advance the slide here. Susanna, go ahead, dive in.
So thanks. One of the things I'd like to point out is that I really think about AI as an opportunity, right? And when people ask me, okay, how do I get started with AI in their business, and in this instance, obviously fleet, one of the things I always say is you don't want to do AI just to be doing AI, right? You need to think about what you're going to do with AI and where you want to focus it and how do you want to pursue whatever opportunity it is that you're choosing to go after. And it's really important that your AI goals be understood and articulated. And more importantly, they need to be aligned to your overall business goals. It's really important that you do that. So it's when you're looking at your goals and objectives, you need to think about where you want to focus AI as an opportunity, and whether it's on optimizing your operations or some sort of predictive way, you really do need to articulate what that is and make sure it's aligned to your overall business goals.
And as I look at AI, one of the things that I really think about is, you know, while there's so many different complexities when it comes to AI, there's so much information being bombarded at us on a daily basis. It changes so frequently. I think the important thing to really realize is that AI has never been simpler to use than it is today, right? So while it may seem quite daunting if you're just getting into it, think about the power that you have to ask questions. If you've used ChatGPT, which most people have, I was doing a couple polls of audiences in recent keynotes, and I think 60 to 70% of people would raise their hands and say, "Yes, I've used ChatGPT before." Think about the power that gives you. You have your personal assistant, and you're using AI if you're doing that. I always tell people I use it to tell my bedtime stories, to my kids, leveraging AI. You can create pictures with it. It's so much more accessible now than it has been before. So while, yes, there are complexities when it comes to AI, it has never, ever been simpler to use and to get benefit from than today. And so as I look at AI from an organization standpoint, typically there's a few different areas that you want to use AI at an organization. So one is to enrich that employee experience, right? So how can you look at AI from the perspective of making sure that the productivity of your employees is that much better? And there's so many different tips and tricks that you can use generative AI for in this case, right? Everything, from translation to chatbots and this kind of thing. The second area is really to look at reshaping your business process. And that's usually through some sort of automation capabilities. Third, bending that curve on innovation. So if you're a product company, you're thinking about new products to create, how do you use AI to think ahead of the competition and think about what outcomes you can create better for your customers? And then the final one for me is looking at reinventing that customer experience, right? You want to make sure that your customers have as strong as experience as possible with your products. And AI is often used, there were chatbots that existed for years before now, but they've gotten so much better thanks to generative AI and the capabilities at understanding the problems that you're actually having. And what I thought I'd do is I'd share a few common use cases. So we implemented, at Geotab an internal, as I think almost everybody did, a GPT kind of put the name of your company here.com. So we have gpt.geotab.com, and we use that internally to help our employees out. And we did a bit of a survey to understand how people are leveraging and using AI within the organization. And keep in mind, we're a software development company. That just gives you some ideas of how we're using it. A code generation and debugging. So if you've got developers on staff or data analysts, they should be using generative AI to help them. It's a huge step, a function better for them. It's funny, the minute you kind of take away that a little bit, you see productivity drop, which is really interesting. Explaining technical concepts. Now it's easier to get people up to speed with what's going on, which I think is fantastic. We've got translation, right? Being able to translate between, languages. If you've used even ChatGPT, the mechanism it has to do real-time translation is absolutely incredible. You can go into a conversation with somebody that you can't even speak that language with, and there's no real delay. It's fascinating. So you should give that a shot if you haven't already. Text editing and rewriting, troubleshooting, problem solving. So we've adopted it from the perspective of a lot of our technical staff is using it to help them in their day-to-day jobs, right? And so I think the best piece of advice I could give here, it's never been easier to use. Don't get scared off by the hype, and you should kind of start with understanding it in your own right? Play around with some of these tools, with Gemini, with ChatGPT, with assistants. If you don't play around with it, you can't kind of understand what its pros are, what the cons are, what it can do, what it can't do. And by understanding these things, educating yourself, that helps you make better decisions for the business too.
Yeah, I have to just add a comment there that the common use cases that you just mentioned that you're seeing, we followed a similar approach at Merchants, which is to bring in a generative AI co-pilot kind of agent, and we're doing the same thing to make sure that our employees are comfortable with it and are working with it. We've even gone as far as had data and AI literacy training specifically around these various types of use.
Well, that's an important point. I think, Suzanne, is like the literacy and the training behind it. I think it's not enough to just bring in the tool. I don't know what your experience has been, but we've got the learning teams here at Geotab help to educate people on how to use and leverage, whole webinars to bring it and make it a heck of a lot more tangible for the broader audience.
Yeah, because there's a lot of fear with AI and intimidation. So that's where we started, right? We looked internally, we looked for adoption within the company, and then once people got comfortable with just chatting, we looked at ways for efficiency and productivity. And that's where we started thinking about our AI strategy. And there are some common strategy focuses or models, if you will, within AI innovation that you can kind of work through. I don't recommend you do them all at the same time. When you're getting started, think about, like I mentioned, aligning to your business goals and objectives. Think about how you want to use AI, and there's a couple of different ways you can do it. Obviously, you can focus on efficiency, which will help you, drive employee efficiency, make your processes more efficient, etc. You could do a productivity strategy where you're driving, less time spent on projects, etc. Effectiveness, making sure that what you're doing is the right thing to be doing at the right time. And then, of course, growth strategy, right, which is where we all want to be eventually, raising that bottom line, etc. And then there's what's called the expert strategy, which is AI everywhere for everything. That's probably not one that most people are in right now, unless you're the big guys, because that's a lot, right? That takes some serious computing and etc. And I would say that more than likely, we're in one of those. You're in one of those other four strategy models, and most companies, most individuals start with internal efficiency and productivity, and then go from there.
And one of the things, kind of bringing it to the fleet side of the equation, as you're looking at opportunities from a fleet perspective, we kind of posed this question earlier this year during our Big Connect conference. To a host of customers. And we looked at it from the perspective of, if you had an AI agent, so, a piece of AI that is autonomously kind of working for you, where do you see the opportunity for that? And it was interesting for us to kind of see where this kind of shook out, right? We looked at it from the perspective of, so we had a number of folks in fleet in the room and looking at both low value and high value use cases, right? And then the reach within the organization. Are you only going to hit a small percentage of people within the organization? Or the more impactful that you can create, your AI strategy, you have higher reach, right? So bar none, so the size of the circle that you see there are the number of groups and people, the themes. We try to collate all the themes together. So by far, this notion of a safety agent kind of really came out. And what that has to do is with coaching, driver behavior. Ultimately, what you're looking at doing is you're looking at driving down collisions in some way, shape, or form. So if you had AI or an agent that helped drive down those collisions for you autonomously, that is something that kind of resonated with a lot of people. So as Susanna mentioned, there's different frameworks that you can leverage and use to understand how you can look at AI within your organization. This is one that we use to broadly gain some alignment. What we found was very, very beneficial here was getting multiple stakeholders in the room, right? And so that you have a framework for understanding where everybody wants to head and the reach that you can have within an organization. I think ultimately, as you're looking at what you want to implement as an organization, you want to be able to measure the impact of it at the end of the day, agree on what's being measured, because only by measuring that will you be able to see how well you've been able to. So are you looking at driving downtime down? Are you looking at driving down collisions? Let's measure where you are today and see the impact that AI is actually having from you, and put it up on a dashboard for everybody to see. You want to see week over week productivity increases. And I think having that on that shared dashboard so that multiple teams can see how you're doing is so crucial. And then one of the strategies that we really look to employ is looking at the difference between kind of high risk AI and low risk AI, because if, and broadly and very simplistically, I'll categorize, if you're a user of AI, you're probably kind of in the low risk AI. If you're trying to create a new model, depending on the complexity of the model, you start verging up into higher risk, right? And if you're just jumping into this, you want to start to be a user of AI. You want to start off with some lower risk applications, and then you can start to gradually get to that higher risk side as you start to understand some of the complexities that do come to play here. I think for us, ultimately, it's making sure that you understand if you are in that kind of user category or in that developer of AI category. Because if you're in a user category, the key stakeholders you want to have, somebody with some AI sense, a project manager. But if you're in this developer of AI, you have to have a whole team and the talent pool to be able to do something with that. And that's not to scare anybody away, because you can certainly be very, very productive on this being a user of AI. But it does get a lot more complex as you start developing your own AI models. And so as an organization, I think you have to understand and decide where you want to play in that spectrum. There's room for everyone, and figure out what high risk and low risk thresholds you're willing to accept. But I do, having everybody bought in, all key stakeholders from the beginning, understanding directionally where the organization wants to go, and constant communication and iteration of your goals is so crucial.
Yeah, I totally agree. And what you mentioned about where are you on the risk level is really important. Right, there's a couple different ways, right? You can do, if you really want, when you're starting slow, think of it as not in front of your customers. You probably don't want to start your first AI project, as I said, in that expert AI everywhere all the time. You want to be perhaps behind the scenes, not client facing. Be a little risk adverse at the beginning while everyone's learning, and then slowly build towards what would entail a bit more risk. But you start to put things out there that are more, not all behind the scenes, but are starting to implement and are enhance customer relations, etc. And then over time, you'll grow as your competency grows, your trust grows, your organizational maturity in AI grows. You can take on some of those larger projects that have more risk. A couple examples of, if you were to take a particular strategy that's looking on the less risky spectrum. This would, say, efficiency, and you're looking to drive efficiency across your organization. These are 4 examples that we've found that resonate in the fleet industry, which is route optimization, preventative maintenance always comes up, being able to know when to do your repairs in a proactive way instead of a reactive way. That's kind of what everybody wants. That's the golden egg, and we're working on that. And then, reducing energy consumption. We all want to reduce our fuel costs. Fuel utilization in fleet is a big topic, and there's a lot of resources spent that way. And when you can reduce your consumption, obviously, we're also reducing our carbon footprint. So these are just a few examples that you can take that's more on the low risk. But eventually, as you get familiar with them, these will, as you know, turn more client facing, right? You'll start to see benefits, not just behind the scenes with trust and your own comfort with your employees, but it will also, trickle down to your bottom line ultimately as they face the customers.
Yeah, and to kind of zoom in on a couple of those different opportunities, certainly, the notion of predictive maintenance and predictive models have been around for a number of years, and some of them are AI based, some of them are more kind of analytic based solutions. Regardless, to your earlier point, Susanna, if you don't necessarily need AI all the time. You have to figure out, it might be a more simple, straightforward data aggregation that you're looking for versus an AI model. But this notion of predictive maintenance is a crucial one for a number of our different customers. Ultimately, what you're kind of trying to do, you're trying to look at minimizing downtime across the board. So kind of new AI models that are coming up there are looking at being able to predict, your probability of things like a tow, right? So while you have certain DTC signals that exist, and that might be real DTC signals or synthetic, like, we've got an electrical systems rating, which will predict when your battery is going to fail within a vehicle. These are all kind of signals. Ultimately, you're trying to reduce that downtime. So if you can look at an AI model that will predict the probability of a tow, all of a sudden now you are looking at risk at a whole new level. You're able to bubble up, instead of looking at all of these different signals that individually, you're able to focus on that one metric that is important to you, and your risk of downtime, your risk of having downtime, your risk of a tow gets bubbled up to you. So this is where AI can really help to weed through a lot of these signals. Comes with proper data governance, data structures behind the scenes, so that you can actually even get to that. But because guess what? As you know, so to get to these nuggets of information, holy smokes, it's not just the fact that you have a DTC code. You have to have a whole data pipeline built to be able to make use of this data and to have it be well governed. And then, you mentioned your certainly routing and logistics and optimization. That can be a complex thing too. You can look at simple routing, but there's also some very, very complex scenarios. You may want to have the right driver, at the right time. And by the right driver, I mean, maybe you're operating, a service-based industry, and there's only certain technicians that can do certain pieces of work, right? You want to route them and get them to the destination in the appropriate time window for that customer, which may vary. So all of a sudden, you've taken what might have been a simple routing problem and turned it into something that's more complex, constraint-based. And there are many different AI solutions to be able to do these more complex routing and optimization problems. We launched one earlier this year around advanced routing and optimization that takes all these constraints into play, because it's not an easy task to do that.
You're absolutely right. And within Fleet, I find it really interesting. The one thing that we actually really excel in Fleet is we have a lot of data, right? Because we've got telematics. Cars are now computers that are sending. We're tracking every single thing that they're doing over time. So we know we've got the massive amounts of data that if we can harness it, we can do a lot of things. Going back to your preventative maintenance example that we talked about, like you said, there's codes, do this at this time, etc. But you can go so much deeper than that because of the data that we actually now have. Through telematics, we know exactly over the past 2 years how this asset, this vehicle, has been driven every single day over the course of those 2 years. We know everything about how it was driven, using, looking at how it's been driven by a driver, what they're doing, etc. So you can get down to the asset level to even maybe put a score on it, right? That this particular vehicle has had hard braking and taking hard turns, etc. Using that level of granularity to give each vehicle an actual score. We can certainly do that. It's possible. And I think that's where, when people think predictive preventative maintenance, that's ultimately where they want to go. Most companies are not there yet, but it's within the art of the possible, right, Mike? I mean, it certainly is possible, because one thing we do have is data.
Yeah, and I think that's where you can also use the data that you're collecting to be able to determine your priority, right? Well, if you look at your maintenance records, where are you having the biggest problems? Is it with the electrical system? Is it with your emissions systems? Focus on one area first, measure where you're currently at, implement predictive maintenance solution, and drive forward in that specific area, and then attack the next nugget. And there are so many different partners in the ecosystem that you can work with to be able to enable some of these incredible insights.
Yeah, and safety, obviously, that's one you mentioned earlier. That is something that is of great importance to all fleet managers, is how can we make our drivers safer? How can we protect our assets? How can we reduce the risk of accidents or breakdowns? And that's another example where we have the data to really excel in this area and predict ahead of time risky behavior and reduce the risk of accident if possible.
You know, what I'm seeing, Suzanne and Mike, which is really fascinating, is we've had these data sets for quite some time, but we really haven't acted on them. I'm starting to see fleets actually act on them. And that would be, this driver is, by an amalgamation of data points, is a risk. I mean, that's kind of table stakes now. This driver is a risk. We need to address it. But then also on the preventive side, certainly on the preventive maintenance side, it's like, okay, I'm seeing all these codes. There's not a DTC code that comes up. And yet I'm being told that this van is going to break down. I've been told by fleet managers that their system, they're listening to their system and taking that vehicle off the road. Well, think about that. Taking that vehicle off the road means that it's going to be down for a certain amount of time to prevent a downtime that could take 3 days, right? But they're trusting the systems to actually do it. It'll take some time before we can do year-over-year comps to see, hey, guess what? We had less breakdowns, and it's because of these robust AI systems.
Right. Most people think when they hear AI, they're thinking they're thinking robots, right? We're not necessarily talking about robots and building super machines. As you said, these examples that we've talked about have been available through us through advanced analytics for some time. And that is also, I think there's a misnomer when people think AI, it's only these great, it's Gen AI, it's robots, it's autonomous cars, right? But, advanced analytics and data science fall into the AI umbrella as well. And falling back on predictive analytics, et cetera, deep learning, machine learning, we can predict the types of things that Mike and I have been talking about here.
Yeah, and I think, it's interesting, Chris. I'm glad you're seeing that as well, too, because I'm seeing the exact same thing with regards to, yes, we've had this data kicking around for many, many years, but I'm seeing more of an appetite to do something with it. And it does take time. It takes trust as well, too, because there's a lot of snake oil out there as well, too, right? And how do you trust what is coming from, an AI model? Well, it's only going to be by implementing it slowly, seeing how it's working for your organization. And I was giving a talk, I think it was a couple months ago, and this example really resonated for the folks in the audience. Typically, the way that you kind of look at driver safety is you have these scorecards, right? That's kind of the old way of doing it. And you've got a scorecard that'll give you, I'm going to put 30% harsh braking, 40% hard acceleration, 20% speeding. You don't really know with certainty what is actually going to make an impact. You're trying to reduce collisions, but we've in the past historically put in front of fleet managers this scorecard, and you don't know what percentages to apply. I actually had a fleet manager, he raised his hand, he said, "Thank God, you mean I don't have to worry about these weights anymore?" I said, "Yeah, you don't, because in new models," and we released one earlier this year, what you're trying to do is reduce collisions. And with that as kind of your goal point, what are all the factors that go into it? Yes, it's the ABCs of telematics, harsh braking, hard acceleration, harsh braking, but there's also a lot more. There's context that comes to play as well. If you're running a fleet across multiple different jurisdictions, you want to look at your overall risk. And that, driving in cities might be more hazardous than, driving on the plains of Idaho. And that driving in weather might be more, but for you to create some sort of score on your own to figure out all of this, it's quite complex. So this is where AI really comes to shine and help. So what we actually did is we monitored a cohort of vehicles in Q1 of this year, that same cohort in Q2. And what we found is the top 10% that were at the highest risk of collision, that's how we're factoring it now, right? It's no longer a score, it's your probability of getting into collision in the next 100,000 miles, right? And we found that the ones that were the 10% most risky were 106% more likely to get into collision in Q2. So, it tells you that if you focus in on those drivers, it can really help you in looking at a reduction in collision. And then there's all sorts of things that you can do to kind of move the needle there. It shouldn't be a negative story, right? There's rewards that you can put in place. You can make it a positive thing, because ultimately you're trying to achieve this shared goal of reducing collisions together. And what we've found certainly is that, yes, there's the impact of ABCs, but like I said, there's also an impact when it comes to the city that you're actually driving into. We see that the example I'm going to show here is one versus kind of Raleigh versus Atlanta, and you can kind of see here you've got kind of weekday driving in both Atlanta and Raleigh, and kind of and weekend as well. No surprise, Atlanta has a higher risk, right? And there's an increased risk in weekday versus weekend. Again, not too much of a surprise, but in Atlanta, there's a higher risk on weekend evenings versus weekday evenings. So these are things that may not be too surprising, but for you to distill all of this information and figure out how to put that into, I don't know, an Excel spreadsheet and give a risk score, that's complex. Just rely on the model figuring that out for you and presenting the highest risk. So we see other indicators, like oftentimes people say speed is such an important factor. Well, in fact, if you look at lower speed, if you're driving in congestion, that is actually a bigger risk factor. We see more collisions happen in these congested areas. We also see whenever vehicles are driving with a variety of kinds of vehicles on the road, it's higher risk too. So if you're driving in more homogeneity with a lot of trucks on the road, less of a risk. Higher risk when you start pulling in different kinds of vehicles, passenger cars, SUVs, Class 8 heavy-duty vehicles. So the higher your variety, the higher risk. Weather events obviously have a huge impact. So all these things come together. Again, hard to distill that information. That's where AI comes in. And now all of a sudden, instead of trying to figure out what weightings you're doing, is, well, I'm at this probability of collision the next 100,000 miles. And how do you know it's bad or good? Well, you compare it against the benchmark. We can tell you if you're best in class. We can tell you if you're at the benchmark, below the benchmark, and coach to the desired effect. So I think this is rapidly changing. We're seeing a lot more, to your point, Chris, adoption of these kinds of insights, because it's becoming easier, because it's becoming more trusted. And I think this revolution of AI over the last 2 years has also helped, because it's created more exposure around AI.
I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, particularly, health and wellness is now a much bigger thing when it comes to fleet safety. And that's where AI can bring some real insights into too. If you can take health and wellness and mash it with predictive stuff, then it becomes even more powerful.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The comment I was going to make is you brought up something that I think is important to talk about, perhaps even more in what can traditionally be seen as a conservative, risk-adverse industry, which is trust. When having your leadership trust the data, as opposed to what they perhaps intuitively know, that they, when the data tells them one thing, as you said, but yet it doesn't make sense. Getting them to trust the data can be a challenge, right? So we test the model, we come through, we do all this training test and use massive amounts of parameters. We're bringing in, as you said, all this different context. We bring in outside weather data that there's an increase of an accident happening on days where the weather is forecasted to be bad, as opposed to the exact same scenario, but with a different weather forecast, right? And it's really hard. I've found, and this is where, again, I fall back on literacy and training and learning to get fleet managers to trust what these models are saying, because sometimes they do not match the narrative that they would be used to hearing. Right, or what has worked in the past, right? What if it's worked in the past? Why break it? Well, we have so many more opportunities now.
I think that's an interesting point, because what I see, as much as you can do to assure yourself, and I'm sure you guys do this, we do the same thing, right? We test our models and you can present that information to customers. But I think the thing that has worked most for us with customers is spot examples, right? For instance, we had one anecdotal piece, and the anecdotal pieces are what usually kind of win that trust over a bit. It's like, you found my knucklehead, right? Like, they looked through the data, it spotted an issue. They were able to actually go out in the field and verify, yeah, you know what? The guy was not exhibiting the safest driving behavior. And it's those little anecdotes that start establishing the trust. Is it going to get it perfect every single time? No. If I could predict who's going to be in a collision tomorrow, I'm not a fortune teller, but that would be incredible. Do they give you that step function advantage so you can reduce collisions? Absolutely. But I think it's about being transparent, with working with the customers, right? And then showing these examples with their actual fleet that make it more real for them, as opposed to documentation that can sometimes be complex to understand.
Yeah, and I think the real power of this, once you hit that benchmark of trust, you can go so much faster. When they really start to trust these models and they see what they can do, and that, oh wow, I can do so much more with this, then suddenly they have so much more power within their grasp. I mean, they can have real-time data coming in as it's happening. They see a driver perhaps who suddenly is, we've got some sort of signal that's showing that they're not driving in the way that they normally do. You could have real-time coaching and monitoring right there, checking in with that driver. Are you okay? Is there something going on? And that goes back to your comment about health and wellness, right? You can take better care of not just your assets, but your employees as well. Once you get over that trust level, there's so much that you can do in this area.
Yeah. So maybe a question over to you, Suzanne. Like, where do you begin, right? And I think that's often the question that people ask, right?
So the best place to start, I have to fall back on this. It is strategy. However, to get trust, I think that your examples are really good. It takes a lot of learning, and it does take patience. And you just have to constantly be being transparent. How did we reach these conclusions, right? And then prove it out in real time. But the beginning is you've got to make sure that say this and it doesn't sound exciting, but aligning your AI strategy with your business goals is so important. So if your goal for the year, one of your goals is to reduce collision percentages, then you can align your strategy with that. We can work on those things. We can build the models that are going to do that. But it does take time to get the leadership to trust. I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we have as AI professionals is getting the business to trust what we're explaining through modeling and, AI.
Susanna, let me just, if I can interject real quick to that point on where do you start? I mean, I think fleet managers are probably like, hey, I don't know if this is a me initiative or if this is a senior management initiative. Do I generate something and then I'm the flag bearer on this and then I have to figure it all out? Or, what really is the path? Because there's no direct path right now. And I think that's where it gets a little bit tricky.
Yeah. I like to tell people, think big, go, just reach for the stars. But when you're starting out, you do need to start small. Figure out a couple POCs or use cases that you feel like would be really impactful. And start small. Don't take it to scale. Just show them in a small contextual example that they can understand what's possible. And then from there, do a couple more of those. At the same time, you're doing all those things that we mentioned at the very beginning of the talk, which is we're getting people used to using AI in their day-to-day work. So we've promoted it internally. We've provided learning opportunities. They're using Gen AI to help them do their jobs. Maybe we've brought in some off-the-shelf productivity gains, etc. So that's happening, which is building trust. And then with these POCs that we can build we bring them to our leadership and say, hey, by the way, while you guys have been learning and using this type of AI, we've now got something to show you. And we want to help you understand that we can actually help reach the organizational goal of reducing collisions.
And I think that, when I look at, why I tend to use AI, because I try to put myself in the perspective of the customers. Like, if I'm using an application that is AI generated, I use it because it's a convenience that saves me time in some way, shape, or form, and leads to better outcomes. Those two kind of need to be in play for technology to be more adopted and used. You got to save you time and lead to some really good outcomes. And so that's why I think that if you're starting, some tangible first things that you can do, you don't want to start off as a developer. Don't try and go into some massive AI project, to Susanna's point. Leverage what's existing, what's out there, because there is so much out there already. And so a couple of really good examples is looking at, from a safety perspective. There's AI in safety. I mentioned it already. Instead of doing these scorecards, present you with the probability of collision in the next. You're using an AI model that is already there and is already proven to help you understand risk within your fleet, right? Things in predictive maintenance, similar examples. There are predictive maintenance models that exist out there that you can leverage and use today. We released an early access earlier this year, the ACE platform. So it's like talking to your fleet, right? So it's like a chat GPT for your fleet. So you can ask it all sorts of questions. It's like your data scientist in a pocket, right? So you can ask it questions around safety, around productivity, around maintenance. And the best way to start is to use it and understand where it performs really well and where it might hallucinate or falter, right? Because when we're talking about now, we've kind of talked a lot about traditional AI. This is an example of, generative AI. And in generative AI, these kinds of systems you've heard the term hallucinate, right? They're not going to get it right all the time, but they're really good at some things. So you have to be able to understand what it is quite good at. And we've certainly learned a heck of a lot over the last couple of years. And the time that we've been spending is making sure that the system is grounded and understands your business. So if you're a fleet manager and you've set up your group hierarchy in some way, you've geofenced different things, you've called things certain names. A great example is my vehicle's name is Roadrunner. If I ask a question about Roadrunner, I don't want it to think I'm asking a question about the animal. It has to understand that Roadrunner in the context of my talking is my vehicle, right? So we spend a lot of time in that. So now things that used to take, minutes, hours, days, you can do within seconds, right? And get a nice report. And then translation of that and what exactly it's done is so crucial. So again, it's that kind of convenience that saves you time. And then the customers, the kinds of things that they're asking, again, this is very much in early access mode right now. We've got a few hundred customers leveraging it. Safety is still, that's the number one thing. So we spend a lot of time talking about safety. There's a reason for that. It's because that's what customers are asking about. Fleet utilization and activity, maintenance. So you can see how it's dispersed around the kinds of questions that people are asking today. But so there's some, all this to be said, there's some very simple things as a user of AI that you can jump into today to get started and start learning.
Yeah, this has been great, and I can't agree with you more, but I would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about some of the challenges that I think any organization is going to face when they're taking on bringing AI, of whether it's the traditional way or Gen AI, into their organization. And the common challenges are the same across industries. It's data readiness. You can have the greatest data in the world, but if you don't have proper data governance, if it's not accessible, if the models you're building cannot use it the way it needs to be used, you're going to challenge. So there may be work that one has to do before you can actually build these models, take them to scale. The systems have to integrate. They've got to be able to talk to each other, right? And then there's always, the big one, which is, AI can be expensive, right? But that doesn't mean that you can't do it. These challenges are not insurmountable in any way. There are ways that you can assess your current environment, provide learning, and then really start to exhibit some true ROI with these examples that we've talked about today. One of the topics that's come up a lot is about, can we trust AI, right? And data privacy, and hot topics all the way around. And at Merchants, we talk about it in the sense of responsible by design. That's security by design, privacy by design, and staying compliant with laws and regulations. I think that this is an extremely important thing to keep in mind when building any AI innovation or model you put it in place. Is you want to make sure that what you're doing is ethical and is also compliant with any local laws and regulations you might have.
Yeah, and to kind of round out on that, I think more and more there are considerations coming to play, especially as you start to think about larger organizations that some are maybe multinational as well too. Is this notion of, we talked a little bit responsible AI, right? So there's lots when it comes to talking about responsible AI. I have kind of top 5 considerations that really come to mind for me, especially as you look at generative AI. One is data confidentiality, right?
Right.
I'm seeing more and more in RFPs that come across, there's generative AI clauses in these RFPs, and it's saying, well, how are you using my data, right? And it's really important to understand. And there's we talk a lot about education. Here's where education is so critical, because something like a large language model, you may be okay with, your data being used alongside, but not being trained on. There's 2 different things, right? If your
Absolutely.
data is going to be used to train the large language model, I can guarantee that's probably something that most organizations can't get alongside. However, if your data is being used with a large language model, it never gets shared with it, but you can allow your employees to get more productivity because you've used LLMs, used it instead of trained on. That's a completely different story. So getting,
Absolutely.
I think, legal on side with how the data is flowing is crucial, because if you can't start there and agree there, you get bottlenecked every step of the way down from that. So I think data confidentiality, understanding these flows is crucial. Abuse and misuse of generative AI systems. It shouldn't answer questions like who, fleet agent, that is, who would win the World Series, right? So it's got to be contextually aware. Explainability is another crucial component. I think because these models can hallucinate, you want to make sure that it's explaining to the user what it's doing. So if I've asked it a question about utilization, it explains to you what it means when it's thinking about utilization, so that you can understand it. Competence and capability is absolutely. This is where grounding. I gave that Roadrunner example a little while back. Grounding your AI on understanding what your fleet actually is doing as a business is crucial. Otherwise, you can ask it questions in your language that it may not understand. So having that competence and capability is important. And then finally, sustainability is coming up. This is a new trend that I've started seeing to emerge over the last few months and year, right? We do a lot of work to look at transportation decarbonization, right? Making sure maybe we're swapping to EVs where we can. On the other side, AI takes up a massive amount of compute.
It does.
And so understanding, and what I think we'll probably end up seeing happening, similar to how you see those little tickers on the, if you're booking a flight, you see the emissions that are associated with each flight. You may end up seeing the emissions associated with different large language models due to compute. So there's different ways you can optimize that. And by 2030, I think about 1.5% of the global energy consumption is going to be attributed to AI. So it's something that we just need to be cognizant of as we're moving down this this road. A large language model isn't needed for everything. We have this notion of small language models that can take up less. Again, these are things that, as developers of AI, we're thinking about, but we're seeing this notion of responsible AI and ethics and data confidentiality and privacy certainly continue to be hot topics for conversation.
Right. And I've called AI several things. I called it an opportunity. I called it what is an ambition, etc. I'll kind of end on one, which is AI is a tool, right? A hammer is a tool. A hammer can build a house, right? You need a hammer to build a house. Well, a hammer can also be used for other purposes. It can tear that house down. It can actually also be used for much more nefarious activities, let's say, right? So AI, on some level, is a tool, and it's all about how you use it. And just because you can doesn't mean you should. And I think as any of us that are working in AI, whether we're developers or users, we should ask ourselves that question. Just because I can, should I?
Hey, listen, why don't we spend the rest of the time to get to some questions? We got it 8.5 minutes, I think, here. This one is really interesting, and I'm going to turn it to Susanna for this one. How can AI help streamline supply chain optimization?
Oh, yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Interestingly, we at Merchants, we recently actually surveyed decision makers in the shipping, trucking, logistics industry, talking about supply chain. And 67% actually said that they believe that AI will help with optimizing their operations this holiday season that coming up, which is not that far off, right? And in the ways that can happen is actually some of the things we've talked about. Demand forecasting, to know when you're going to need those assets to get them on the road when you need them, rather than, oh, we need this many, but we don't have that many. You can use AI to help you there. Again, route optimization is always going to be a big one and help you get there. And then inventory management, right? Making sure that you've got what you need, but not too much, because you don't want to sit on a lot of inventory all year round waiting for the holidays when you're going to need them. You don't need them all year round. You need them in December. And then finally, we can better the customer experience using AI. So that's a really great question. And I think that fleet is going to see some massive improvements this holiday season, which will be the case studies that we will use over the next year to build that trust.
That's really interesting. That kind of leads to my the next question here I'm going to tee up. And that is, okay, so I want visibility into my supply chain. Do I actually just open ChatGPT and start asking ChatGPT questions, or like there's systems out there that are going to really help me do that I, as a FedEx ISP, don't know yet, Mm-hmm. I mean, so I'm going to leave you with that. But the question is, like, is there one AI platform that you would want to do your job without, you couldn't do your job without? And what is that platform? But there's just so many of them out there.
Yeah, there are.
There's so many platforms out there, and there's a new one coming out almost every single day, right? And I think what I have is I have different tools for different purposes and uses, right? And you got to kind of find what works best for you. A great example, you've got we've used Gemini, I've used Open AI's ChatGPT. I find that the nicety that comes with Gemini, which is Google's AI tool, right? It by default understands all of your documents. So if you've got Google Docs, you've got all of your slides. You're able to ask it a question about anything that you have access to in your company's repository, and it can come up with answers. So it's nicely tied. If you're a Google, company, it ties to your ecosystem. There's wonderful tools for image generation, for video generation. So I think each one kind of has its own specialty, and you'll see ranking boards as well too, right? Like Gemini's, I think, just popped up on top over the last few days. But some are really good at helping you at code. OpenAI's GPT-01 does a little bit more thinking and reasoning behind the scenes. And there's also free ones or open source ones, right? So if you're using an open source one, you got to think about how you're using it. If you're trying to pull that into your own technology stack, it's great that it's open source, but now you have to be in charge of scaling that. And there's a whole other host of problems. But I think I don't think there's any kind of one answer. You got to find what works best for your intended purpose.
Yeah, I actually on that, and I recently read a book, and forgive me, I can't remember the name of the author. It's called Co-Intelligence, and it was actually a book about AI specifically meant for business leaders. And the point that it makes that I want to mention is there are so many, there's so many different ones talking about Gen AI agents. And the author actually proposed that you approach each one as you would an individual, meaning if you ask 5 individuals the same question, you may get 5 answers. They may all be right? Or you may get more context with one than another. If that particular person or model, in this case, has more information to give you greater context. So the author proposed that when interacting with these, think of it as a person, and ask the question, which we call prompt engineering, right? Ask it the same way you would ask a person who you don't know how much context they have. And they're all just a little bit different in that way, just as a room full of people are going to be different.
Yeah, and you can ask the same question twice and get slightly different answers. But guess what? You ask a person the same question twice, you're going to get 2 different answers as well too. So it's been trained on the corpus of human knowledge and understanding. So I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think each has its own set and purpose. They're evolving constantly. One thing is for sure, you got to start. You got to start somewhere. Don't be afraid not to start, I think is the key. Because I think you can't really make a wrong decision here. It's going to help you. It's going to help you be more productive, whether you're using Anthropic or Gemini or GPT-4, whatever. It's going to help you.
I think we can absolutely agree that this is what would be called a disruptive innovation. Just as fire and the printing press and the steam engine are all massively disruptive technologies and innovations, this is our next one. This is this is the next disruptive technology for the human race.
Yeah. Let me see. We've got time for one more question, I guess. I mean, I'll go general here with this one. Have you seen AI conflict with just what is common sense? And then how do you say no to that and trust your gut? Trust but verify. I mean, what are the steps you can take as an individual user?
I think that relying on the explainability is really important, right? I've seen AI misstep, but when it's explaining to me what it's done, you can oftentimes see where that misunderstanding may have been, right? So I think without that transparency, it becomes a little bit difficult to judge. That's why I think in any AI system that you're looking at adopting, having some explainability there so that you can have that human judgment, right? And some things may seem counterintuitive and they may be actually on the correct path and you got to trust it, and other things not. So that's where I think these small POCs, understanding how it works for your specific process, if you're using it from a fleet safety perspective, use it for a while and see where its strengths are, where its weaknesses are, because if you don't use it, you won't understand.
Absolutely. If you don't use it, you won't understand. So don't be afraid of it. Go out there, play with it, and learn a little bit. Just play with it.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Listen, why don't we leave it at that? Really robust conversation. Thank you, Susanna and Mike, and thank you, audience, for participating. This will be available on demand as well. And hey, we'll see you next time. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you.
Bye.